Number 10. The Lusitania. If there's one ship that's played a pivotal role in a war, it's the RMS Lusitania. And surprisingly, the ship wasn't even made for fighting. The Lusitania was built as a passenger liner and first set sail in 1907. She was mainly used for transatlantic crossings and had over 100 trips between the UK and the United States under her belt, but something would stop her from completing her 101st journey. In May 1915, 1 year after the start of World War I, the Lusitania was transporting over 1,900 passengers from New York to Liverpool, England. During this time, naval combat was taking place across the seas of Europe, with ships having to dodge not only mines, but also German U-boats. People were warned to make ocean voyages at their own risk, and captains were told to be careful. But the Lusitania didn't seem to get the message. As the ship reached the southern coast of Ireland, very close to its destination, it was struck by a torpedo from a German U-boat. After this, another explosion echoed through the ship, with many believing that this was the steamboat's boilers blowing up after taking on heavy damage. The destruction was so catastrophic that the Lusitania sank within 20 minutes. Out of the 1,900 people on board, 1,100 died, including over 100 U.S. citizens. This caused attitudes towards Germany to sour in the States, especially since the Lusitania was not a warship. Although it took almost 2 years after this incident to happen, the sinking of the Lusitania was one of the main reasons why the U.S. joined the war effort in World War I, helping to turn the tide against German forces. Number 9. Japanese cruiser Aoba. The Japanese heavy cruiser called Aoba was a warship used during World War II. She was built in 1926, but she was mainly used in the 1940s, after being given a complete overhaul between 1938 and 1940 to bring her up to the current military standards of the time. With a length of 607 feet, she was decked out with 10 different naval guns, 8 torpedo tubes, and her crew were able to operate 50 anti-aircraft guns on her deck. If one thing is for sure, the Aoba was not a ship to be taken lightly. Mainly patrolling around the seas of China, Aoba knew how to handle herself in a fight. She and her crew were part of many naval battles, meaning she had to dock frequently in order to get repairs done on her battle scars. But there would be one battle the Aoba wouldn't come back from. On the 24th of July 1945, the ship was in Kura Harbor, recovering from the wounds of previous battles that left it unable to fight. While she was at her most vulnerable, the location was struck by U.S. bombs, the largest of which weighed 2,000 pounds. Not many things could survive an attack of that power. Despite her ability to push through most attacks, the Aoba sank, her wreckage left completely unsalvageable. Interestingly, the bomb that sank her was released by none other than Dick H. Gwynn, who would later become the U.S. Vice Admiral. Number 8. The SS Athenia. The SS Athenia was a British passenger-carrying ship that was setting sail at the beginning of September 1939 and heading towards the U.S. Michael McShane was there, heading back home from Europe, which was gripped with fear at the outbreak of World War II, which had just begun. The Athenia was one of the only passenger liners still running, since many others had had their journeys cancelled or had been taken by the British government to be converted for military use. Despite only second and third class tickets being available, the ship was still pretty luxurious, with stewards on hand for passenger needs and multiple lounges, bars, and smoking rooms for them to enjoy. While those on board sat down to enjoy dinner, a massive explosion rocked the ship. They'd been struck by a torpedo. The engine room flooded with water, and the crew that was left started evacuating the passengers onto lifeboats. Packed in with over 80 people per boat and only a life jacket made of canvas and cork, the passengers waited for rescue as the Athenia sank. With war declarations only a few hours old, the SS Athenia, a passenger-carrying vessel, was the first ship to be torpedoed in what would become a 6-year war. More than 100 people perished, but McShane and many others survived to tell their stories. Number 7. The Mary Rose. The Mary Rose was the pride and joy of King Henry VIII. You might remember him as the king who had 6 wives. He was set on expanding England's navy, and during his reign, the number of military ships in the country had grown from 5 to 58 vessels. Built in Portsmouth in 1510, the Mary Rose was at the cutting edge of shipbuilding technology. Weighing in at 600 tons, she was one of the first ships to have gun ports, which allowed her crew to fire cannons from the side of the ship rather than on top of its deck. The English at the time were very good at picking fights with their neighbors, Scotland and France. Many conflicts between the nations took place over the years, and the Mary Rose fought in quite a few, including the Battle of Saint-Mathieu and the Battle of Flodden. But the Mary Rose's last battle would be in 1545. The 34-year-old ship was once again in combat with the French in the Battle of the Solent, a sea that stretches between the Isle of Wight and the UK city of Portsmouth. It's unknown exactly how the Mary Rose sank, but many believe it was thanks to the state-of-the-art gun ports. It is said that while turning, she managed to tip over on her side low enough for water to enter the gun ports, logging her down under the waves. There are many arguments for how this happened, including the fact that her captain was on his first campaign, that she was caught in a gust of wind, that she was too heavy with all the men and equipment, or even that the French Navy managed to land a hit on her. What do you think happened to the Mary Rose? Let us know in the comments. Number 6. The HMS Sheffield. The HMS Sheffield, a guided missile destroyer, was a part of Task Force 317. The 317 was a group of British ships sent to the Falkland Islands off the coast of Argentina during the Falklands War. It had a crew of 268 men and weighed 4,100 tons. In April 1982, Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands, a British territory, so the UK government sent out an armed response to help the people there. By May, many of the British naval ships had arrived, including the HMS Sheffield. But on May 4th, an Argentinian bomber spotted the ship and fired an Exocet missile towards it. The missile went straight through the ship's hull and into the control room, causing a fire to break out. As the equipment burned, toxic gases were released, and the crew quickly began evacuating to get away from the poisonous vapors. It was a slow death for the HMS Sheffield. It took 6 days for the damage to fully take hold and for it to sink while being towed to safety. It ended up getting waterlogged and capsizing. Thankfully, many of the crew survived. 20 men lost their lives, and many more suffered injuries from the fire and blast. The HMS Sheffield was the first British warship to be sunk in over 37 years, and the first to sink as a result of the Falklands conflict. The Falklands War ended a little over a month later, with Argentina formally surrendering on June 20th. Number 5. The HMS Hawk. You may think the middle name Hawk is kind of strange to give a newborn girl, especially when the child was born in 1915, over 100 years ago. But that's exactly what happened when Maggie Power named her daughter. Sadly, there's an unfortunate reason for this unusual middle name. Margaret Hawk Lenz shares her middle name with a warship her father died on 5 months before she was born. On October 15, 1914, the HMS Hawk was part of a group of ships patrolling the North Sea off the east coast of Scotland. The Hawk was one of the oldest ships in the British Navy at the time, part of the Edgar class of warships. HMS Hawk first set sail back in 1891. It broke formation with her fellow warships to pick up some mail that was delivered by another ship. After collecting it, she tried to catch up with the rest of the group, but never made it. A torpedo from a feared German U-boat U-9 struck her. The losses on board the Hawk were huge. Over 524 men are believed to have been killed, among them Margaret's father, Joyce Powers. The youngest person to die on board in this tragedy was just 14 years old. The German U-9, though, managed to survive the war and was the only U-boat to make it through to the end of World War I. Number 4. The Arandora Star. The Arandora Star is not only one of the biggest naval tragedies in history, but also one of the biggest ironic moments of World War II. Originally used as a passenger-carrying liner, the Arandora Star was converted during the war to be used as a transport ship. On July 2, 1940, almost 1,600 people boarded the ship in Liverpool. 200 guards, 400 German internees, 700 Italian internees, and 86 German prisoners of war got on. They had all been at an internment camp near the city, but were being relocated to Canada since the British government was getting scared the Germans might invade the UK, especially with the rate they were pushing through France during this time. The Arandora Star was just a short distance into her Atlantic crossing, around 75 miles from the Irish coast, when she was torpedoed by a German U-boat. The U-boat thought the Star was an armed merchant ship and were completely unaware of who was actually on board. Over 800 people lost their lives, meaning that over half the people on board died from the attack. Due to the passenger status, being under guard, and the barbed wire dotted around the deck to stop escapes, many were unable to get off the ship and survive. Sadly, the death toll included many elderly people who were unable to make their way up from the bottom decks. For those that survived, they would have to make the journey to Canada again shortly after. This tragedy was a steep learning curve for Britain, and after this incident, they stopped all future deportations. Number 3. The HMS Jervis Bay. HMS Jervis Bay started out as a merchant ship in 1922. As World War II dawned in 1939, it, like many other ships, was converted in order to help the war effort. By October 1st of that year, she was officially a merchant cruiser, decked out with 8 6-inch guns, 2 high-angle guns, and other military equipment. On October 28, 1940, Jervis Bay was escorting a fleet of 37 ships alongside 2 Canadian destroyers. Halfway through the trip, the Canadian ships peeled off, leaving the Jervis Bay to lead the fleet alone. Slowly, an enemy warship approached the convoy and was identified as the German ship Admiral Scheer. The order was given for the convoy to split up to avoid being attacked, but the captain of the HMS Jervis Bay knew they needed to buy time for this to happen successfully. Despite being completely outmatched by the Germans, they squared up to fight. The Admiral Scheer hit the bay hard, Using every single piece of artillery it had, each strike against Jervis Bay unleashed 4,700 pounds of high explosive force. The bay managed to hold out for 2 hours before it sank, claiming the lives of 189 men on board, including Captain Fagan. Their efforts weren't in vain, though. 32 ships in the convoy managed to reach safe waters. Her captain, E.S. Fagan, was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest and most prestigious honor in the British Armed Forces. Number 2. The CSS Alabama. During the American Civil War, the Confederate States requested the construction of many ships that were mainly built in Liverpool, England, and then sailed across the Atlantic. One of these ships was the Enrica, built in 1862 and later called the CSS Alabama. Combining steam power and wind in her sails, the CSS Alabama was a feared blockade runner, measuring 220 feet in length and fitted out with armaments allowing her to wreak havoc on Union fleets. The CSS Alabama and her crew, led by Captain Raphael Sims, were an incredibly dangerous combination. From August 13, 1862 until June 19, 1864, the ship captured over 55 vessels, burning and destroying them. To put that into perspective, the CSS Alabama was taking down an entire ship every 11 days. It's no wonder the Union forces went on a manhunt to track her down and put a stop to her destruction. All the while, the CSS Alabama was sailing around the world, making stops in locations like India and South America. After working so hard for so long, Captain Sims believed the ship was due for a refit and headed off to France to see if the repairs and maintenance could be carried out there. But the French refused to let the Alabama dock. Making their way out of Cherbourg Harbor on June 19th, the ship ran into the USS Kearsarge, and a fierce battle broke out between the two. This served as entertainment for the French at the time, with many gathering at the coast to watch the ships go at each other. Eventually, the Kearsarge was victorious. After being one of the most terrifying things on the water, the CSS Alabama finally sank to a watery grave. Number 1. The Bismarck. Considered more of a floating fortress than an actual warship, the German ship the Bismarck set out on the seas for the first time on May 19, 1941. Just 8 days later, it would be completely destroyed. Weighing over 50,000 tons and measuring over 792 feet in length, it was the largest German warship ever built. It's easy to understand why the Allied forces were scared of what this monster could be capable of, and as soon as they learned it set sail into the Baltic Sea, the British Navy sent out a fleet to track it down. Among the ships sent out to fight it was the HMS Hood, which was the flagship for the Royal Navy. It was the largest and most famous warship, constructed in 1918. After managing to find the Bismarck between Iceland and Greenland, the battle began. The HMS Hood started out strong, launching shells from over 14 miles away, narrowly missing the German ship. Although they didn't hit, they were enough to rattle the crew who, as the Hood closed in, started their counterattack. The two ocean behemoths were locked in explosive combat for 4 minutes before the first nail was put in Hood's coffin. Battered by a number of shells, an armor-piercing round ripped through the warship and into its ammunition magazine. The result was an explosion so intense that a pillar of fire and destruction reached 600 feet into the air. All the other British ships could do was watch as the HMS Hood literally snapped in half and sank. Of the 1,421 people on board, only 3 survived, making it the largest loss of life in Royal Navy history. Although it won the fight, the Bismarck didn't make it out of the battle unharmed. It began to limp its way back to port to make crucial repairs, but knowing it was damaged, the British Navy wasn't going to let it slip away. They sent every ship they possibly could after it in pursuit. The Bismarck was only 12 hours from safety when an aerial assault was launched. British biplanes swarmed the warship, but they were incredibly old models. Surprisingly, this worked to their advantage though, since they flew so low and so close to the ship that the Bismarck was unable to track the planes with their guns. The Fairey Swordfish airplanes hit a weak spot, the Bismarck's rudders. They ripped a hole in the side of the ship and immobilized it. May 26th would be the last night the Bismarck would spend afloat. The next morning, after a relentless assault by British warships, it sank with 2,000 soldiers on board. Number 5. Hawker Siddeley Harrier. Developed during the 1960s for the British military, the Hawker Siddeley Harrier was the first of the Harrier jump jet series of attack aircraft. It was the first operational ground attack and reconnaissance jet with vertical short takeoff and landing capabilities. This made the Harrier especially useful for situations with limited ground space and short runways, giving it an advantage over most other aircraft at the time. The Harrier was first used by the British Royal Air Force, RAF. Most of the planes were positioned in West Germany, where they stood ready to respond to a potential invasion by the Eastern en bloc. In the 1970s, the United States Marine Corps USMC obtained its own fleet of Harriers. They used the aircraft mainly for close air support and typically operated the planes from amphibious assault ships, which were prepared to respond to an enemy by air, land, and sea. During that same period, the Harrier's designers continued to develop, improve, and diversify its capabilities. They created the British Aerospace Sea Harrier jet fighter, which was capable of vertical takeoff and landing. It was used primarily by the British Navy starting in 1980. Both the Harrier and the Sea Harrier fought in the Falklands War between the UK and Argentina in 1982. The planes proved to be crucial to the British effort owing to their versatility. Several other variations of the Harrier were developed over the following years, but the earliest models are no longer in service. The last first-generation Harriers were retired in 2006 by the Thai military, and the Indian military withdrew the final Sea Harriers from service in 2016. While some of the planes ended up on display in museums, others have met less glamorous ends. The aircraft in this photo is a British Aerospace Harrier II. It's a second-generation model that was developed based on earlier Harriers and first entered service during the late 1980s. This particular plane somehow ended up in the River Ems in northern Germany in 1991. Very little information is available regarding the circumstances surrounding the photo other than the fact that it was taken in the West German state of North Rhine-Westphalia. Based on when and where the image was taken, the Harrier was likely serving under a squadron of the Royal Air Force that was stationed in Germany. Much like the Harrier jets before it, the Harrier II was on standby to deter Soviet aggression. The aircraft was forced into early retirement in 2010 due to financial pressures on the British military. Number 4. The world's largest ship graveyard. Along Africa's western coast is a small peninsula called Ras Nouadhibou. It's shared between Mauritania and Western Sahara. The eastern side, occupied by Mauritania, is home to the city of Nouadhibou. With a population of around 100,000 residents, it's the country's second largest settlement. It's also Mauritania's financial capital. But Nouadhibou has some less brag-worthy accomplishments. It's where you'll find the world's largest ship graveyard, with roughly 300 dilapidated vessels crammed along a section of its coastline. The ship started amassing over a century ago, starting with a French Navy cruiser called the Chassepot Aoba. Built during the 1890s in response to the French military's growing fears about Italy and Germany's advancing fleets, the vessel was meant to bolster the country's cruiser force throughout its colonial territories. After World War I, the Chassepot Aoba was decommissioned and sold to a private fishery. It functioned as a water cistern and a floating warehouse before falling into disrepair and being deserted at Nouadhibou during the 1920s. At one point, it was converted into a floating theater, but it wasn't long before the ship went back to being little more than a pitiful hunk of rusting metal, much like all the other vessels that accumulated in the harbor over the following decades. When the Mauritanian government ran into money problems, authorities began accepting bribes from ship owners in exchange for allowing them to abandon their unwanted boats in the harbor. Unwanted boats also appeared for other reasons, including failed business ventures and owners who bought old vessels only to realize they were in way over their heads when it came to the amount of repairs and maintenance they needed. The problem increased dramatically throughout the 1980s. Corrupt officials were more willing than ever to overlook the environmental hazards associated with carelessly dumping a ship for the sake of financial gain, resulting in the fascinating but incredibly dangerous collection of derelict vessels that remain at the site today. Mauritania lacks the infrastructure to properly dispose of the boats in Nouadhibou harbor, and the ships were continuing to appear as recently as 2013. While the coastline is littered with old ships, some stand out among the others. One of the most famous wrecks at Nouadhibou Bay is the nearly 400-foot-long United Malika, a Moroccan reefer vessel that ran aground in 2003. Luckily, all 17 crew members survived and were rescued by the Mauritanian Navy. Numerous ideas for how to best help the country clean up the ship graveyard has been put forth over the years, but none of these proposals have come to fruition. And while an increasing number of activists are calling for the mess to be properly dealt with, the government has yet to take meaningful action. The ships have had some unintended positive effects. They function as artificial reefs and have helped to restore marine species that were previously decimated by overfishing. They're also home to birds, and some of the boats have even come to function as de facto ecosystems. But the hazards of the wrecks outweigh the benefits, and the ship graveyard continues to be a lucrative source of income. In addition to the lack of resources for disposing of the ships, the ability for locals to make money from the vessels discourages authorities from taking swift action to stem the pollution. The future of the site remains uncertain as environmental activists and profit-driven minds remain entangled in a tug-of-war over what the appropriate next steps are. Number 3. Malow's Bay Ghost Fleet. Located on the Maryland side of the Potomac River, Mallow's Bay is home to what many describe as the largest shipwreck fleet in the Western Hemisphere. The small bay's relatively shallow waters are littered with the decaying remnants of hundreds of old ships, including nearly 230 World War I-era United States Shipping Board Merchant Fleet Corporation vessels. At least 100 of the wrecks consist of the remains of wooden steamships that were built for crossing the Atlantic Ocean during the Great War. There was a steel shortage at the time, leaving shipbuilders with no choice other than to work with what was available to them, namely wood. But using outdated materials and building the vessels as quickly as possible proved to be problematic. By the time many of the wooden ships were completed, they were both obsolete and poorly built. Not a single one of the ships crossed the ocean by the time Germany surrendered and the war came to an end. At that point, there was no longer a steel shortage, rendering the vessels completely useless to the American military. In the war's immediate aftermath, the unwanted ships were stored in the James River at a cost of around $50,000 per month. The Navy had no use for them and didn't want them. It seemed like they had finally found a home when the Western Marine and Salvage Company bought them and towed them to Mallow's Bay in 1925. But the business went bankrupt and the ships were burned and abandoned. During World War II, the Bethlehem Steel Company recovered any useful metal from the wrecks. Several dozen wrecks remain visible to this day. In the 1960s, activists raised environmental concerns over the possibility that hazardous materials from the ships were polluting the bay. A closer look revealed that the wildlife was actually benefiting from their presence and that many species had taken up residence among the wrecks. Today, the site continues to function as an artificial reef hosting an array of wildlife. It's a popular destination among canoers and kayakers and was declared a national marine sanctuary in 2019. Visitors are reminded to exercise utmost caution and respect among the wrecks and not to climb onto the ships or take anything, but to respectfully observe, take photos, and leave the site just as they found it. Number 2. World War II Aircraft Graveyard. Hundreds of World War II-era planes have come to rest at the bottom of the world's oceans. Some crashed and met tragic ends, while others were submerged on purpose to avoid having them fall into the wrong hands. And it's easy to forget how many of these historic aircraft are lurking out of our sight. After all, it's easy to forget about something that you have to actively look for to know it's even there. In recent years, a Coast Guard diver and underwater photographer from Wisconsin named Brandy Muller has helped to draw attention to some of these hidden planes. During her travels in the South Pacific, she visited an underwater graveyard of U.S. military aircraft that were deliberately dumped at the end of the war near the Marshall Islands. Muller was scuba diving several miles off the coast of the island of Roy Namur when she captured stunning images of the more than 150 planes that American forces discarded into the ocean in 1945. She encountered the sprawling site at a depth of roughly 130 feet, where they sit surrounded by coral, fish, and other sea life who have repurposed the vehicles as artificial reefs. Numerous iconic American planes can be found among the collection, including Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers, 4FU Corsair, and TBM Avengers. Muller told the Daily Mail that many of the aircraft are impressively intact for their age and for having sat in ocean water for upwards of 70 years. She described the experience as weird and strange, mainly because airplanes don't belong underwater. But once she got past the eeriness of exploring the out-of-place vehicles, she said that the opportunity to see them up close was both amazing and special. The young woman was particularly taken aback by the realization that the dozens of vehicles were in good working order when the military disposed of them. This much is clear even based on their current condition. Even though time has taken an obvious toll on the planes, they don't seem to bear any serious battle-related damage. Many, if not most of the planes likely arrived in the Marshall Islands in 1944 during the Battle of Kwajalein, which lasted for 4 days starting in late January of that year. The Japanese were outnumbered and ill-prepared, but nevertheless fought with fierce resistance, leaving just 51 survivors out of the 3,500 soldiers who participated in the battle. Over the following year, the two enemies grappled for control over the South Pacific, and the Allies eventually gained an upper hand. Even after losing their grip on the region, the Japanese continued to fight with everything they had until the country's official surrender following the U.S. bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And when all was said and done, the Americans no longer needed the planes they had brought with them, so they were sunken and soon forgot about. Number 1. $1 Million Point. Many of the U.S. military's attacks against the Japanese during World War II were launched from the island of Espiritu Santo, which is part of the Republic of Vanuatu in the South Pacific. When the war ended, American forces dumped literal tons of trash and dozens of vehicles in the waters off the island's coast. The discarded collection included bulldozers, tractors, forklifts, jeeps, trucks, and more. To many, it seemed wasteful to dispose of equipment that the local population could use and benefit from. But when the island's officials and the military failed to negotiate an agreement for the sale of the vehicles, years, the nearby ocean became a junkyard for the machinery. U.S. officials determined that tossing the equipment like trash was more cost-effective than bringing it all back to America, and since they were unwilling to donate it, that's what happened. The Americans didn't necessarily have a direct grudge against the locals in Vanuatu, but at the time the archipelago was under British and French colonial control, and they wanted to make sure that they didn't leave either country's military with any free equipment or supplies. They offered the goods for sale at a low cost, but the British and French reportedly believed that if they turned down the offer, the U.S. would be left with no choice but to leave everything behind for free. So they got rid of every last possible item of value, including bottles of Coca-Cola, clothing, and everything else. They even drove their bulldozers into the water after using them to dispose of the rest of their inventory. In hindsight, some experts have speculated that the U.S. may have gotten rid of the vehicles because a massive influx of low-cost machines into the American market posed a potential threat to the national economy. But this realization doesn't make it any less shocking or disappointing to picture Navy Seabees driving the equipment off a purpose-built ramp and into the water as residents looked on. It's also been discovered that the official military records from the time fail to convey the magnitude of the dumping. Actually, if anything, they wildly downplay the amount of vehicles and other items that were tossed into the sea, claiming that just a modest amount of dumping took place. The blatant falsification of these records indicates that the American military was perhaps all too aware that their decision to ditch millions of dollars worth of machinery was controversial from both an environmental and an ethical standpoint. Once U.S. forces cleared out, locals salvaged what they could of the materials, but the vast majority of what was dumped remains at the site to this day. It's popular among divers, but for some, it's a reminder of a hugely wasteful decision to pollute the environment and extend little consideration for the best interests of the people living in the area.
3. The U.S. bolsters its defenses. In 2012, word got out that the United States planned to build a new missile defense shield in southern Japan. The system was intended to protect against what intelligence officials identified as a growing threat from China and North Korea. Defense officials told the Wall Street Journal that a strong early warning radar called X-band would be implemented into the new anti-missile shield, and that it would connect to an existing system in northern Japan that had been in place since 2006. There were also plans for a third X-band installation, with the potential to monitor China, Taiwan, and North Korea. The decision was announced shortly after the People's Liberation Army of China tested an intercontinental ballistic missile, which was capable of reaching any city in the United States. Known as the DF-41 missile, it contains 10 warheads that can be programmed to strike at different locations. Speaking on the condition of anonymity, a US official told the news outlet Executive Gov that the American government perceived the missile test as an imminent threat and felt compelled to take steps to safeguard the country by bolstering its own defenses. The question of what might happen if the US and China go to war has been asked many times over the years, and the predictions have changed amid the constantly fluctuating tensions between the two superpowers. As national interest writer Robert Farley pointed out in 2021, at one time, the only fathomable motivation for a war between America and China would be a dispute over North Korea or Taiwan. And while this remains a distinct possibility, the list of potential reasons for a direct military conflict has grown in recent years. China's expanding interests and capabilities are major factors in the disagreements between the two countries. Over the last 20 years or so, China's wealth has skyrocketed. And in keeping with the old adage, money is power, the country's impressive economic gains have given it major political foothold in world politics. Adding to these rapidly shifting power dynamics is the massive buildup and modernization of the Chinese military, a major priority of current President Xi Jinping, who plans on securing a third term later this year. In keeping with his goals, China comes second only to the US when it comes to spending the most money on their militaries. And while a huge portion of that spending has gone toward expanding its navy and building newer, better, and more advanced ships and other equipment, a sizable chunk of China's defense budget is spent on nuclear weapons. China is notoriously secretive about exactly how much money it spends. But based on the rate that things seem to be going, experts predict that the country could quadruple its nuclear stockpile by 2030, putting the number of warheads in its possession as high as 1,000. State-sponsored media scoffed at the claim, describing it as wild and biased speculation. Chinese officials insist that the country's nuclear arsenal is kept at a minimal level, but those keeping as close of an eye as possible on these operations adamantly disagree. Concerns based on actual evidence of China's nuclear buildup are exacerbated by its leaders' reluctance to engage in dialogue and work toward building trust with other countries. In addition to the production of ICBMs, China appears to have its sights set on developing hypersonic missiles. They travel at 5 times the speed of sound and are difficult to detect with radar, giving those at the target site almost no time to launch an effective defense. Much like officials have downplayed their nuclear efforts, they also denied their hypersonic ambitions. But in 2021, the country performed 2 test launches of a hypersonic missile. Both times, it flew around the globe before aiming for its target. The first time, the missile missed the mark by roughly 24 miles. Defense expert Dr. Zeno Leone told the BBC that China's top-ranking officials know that the country is behind when it comes to military technology, and that this is fueling its frenzied efforts to not only catch up to, but to supersede other countries. Some predict that China could become a major threat to Western countries in a relatively short time. For now, the US remains superior to China as far as nuclear weapons go. Jeffrey Lewis, who directs the East Asian Non-Proliferation Program at the Monterey Institute of International Studies, told the BBC that if the US waged a nuclear attack on Beijing, only a small number of China's nuclear stockpile would survive, and that America's nuclear defense system in Alaska might be able to handle what's left. Not all experts perceive China's growing military and weapons test as an emerging threat to the Western world. In fact, some believe that the country has been an ever-present threat since the 1980s. There are also disagreements on how to properly respond to the situation. Lewis believes that acting out of fear and vulnerability could prompt US officials to create disastrous foreign policies that do the opposite of protecting the country. He blames America's withdrawal from the 1972 anti-ballistic missile, an agreement between the US and the Soviet Union that limited the anti-ballistic missile systems that are used to defend against nuclear attacks. The treaty was meant to dissuade the parties from continuing to build nuclear weapons as a way to maintain deterrence. After the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia decided to continue honoring the agreement, which remained in place until 2002, when the US withdrew. In the years since, nearly all of America's major adversaries have sought to expand their nuclear capabilities and arsenals. Some would argue that these countries, including the US, are embroiled in an ongoing global arms race, and that a lot of the ongoing development is fueled by the perceived need to perpetually strengthen a country against those who might attack it. Do you keep up with world politics? Tell us in the comments and hit subscribe while you're at it. 2. North Korea. The United States and North Korea have been deeply at odds since the emergence of the Hermit Kingdom and the Korean War between the Communist North and the capitalist South. America's continued support for South Korea and its vehement disapproval of North Korea's oppressive authoritarian dictatorship are just some of the reasons why the two countries don't get along. The looming prospect of massively destructive warfare between the US and North Korea has lingered for decades. From a young age, schoolchildren in North Korea are indoctrinated with beliefs that Americans are murderous imperialists who started the Korean War, even though the conflict actually began when North Korea invaded South Korea. This anti-American propaganda is especially effective given the dictatorship's all-out control over the media and the strict ban on spreading information or views that don't align with the regime's agenda. Simply put, it's easy to see why there are long-standing fears that the US and North Korea will eventually come to blows. After rising to power following his father's death in 2011, Kim Jong-un hugely stepped up the Hermit Kingdom efforts to develop powerful weapons of mass destruction. Since then, experts speculate that North Korea has amassed an arsenal of somewhere between 30 and 40 nuclear weapons. Some analysts estimate that Kim has acquisitioned enough materials to build as many as 100 nuclear weapons, indicating that the dictator's collection is likely to continue growing as he remains fixated on developing explosives with devastating capabilities. Concerns about political warfare between the US and North Korea have only grown in recent years. Donald Trump's presidency marked a distinct turning point in the rising tensions shortly after he took office in early 2016. As a man who's known for not mincing words, Trump wasted little time vocalizing his feelings about North Korea and its third-generation despot Kim Jong-un. And he did so in his trademark inflammatory way, taunting Kim for his obsession with building nuclear weapons and mockingly referring to him as Rocket Man. In response, Kim called Trump a mentally deranged dotard. At first glance, the interactions may have seemed like the type of obnoxious tit-for-tat that most self-respecting adults roll their eyes at. But the gravity of the words being slung back and forth hit differently for those who found themselves seriously questioning the mental stability of both leaders. It was even more terrifying to think about the fact that the disagreeing parties both had the power to deploy explosives that could claim hundreds of thousands of lives with the push of a button. Oddly, the war of words somehow led to plans for Trump and Kim to sit down for a civilized discussion on how to potentially work past the two countries' differences and move forward peacefully. The meeting took place in 2019 in the demilitarized zone along the 38th parallel, which separates North and South Korea. During the historic summit, the two leaders signed an agreement to work together toward establishing a lasting and stable peace regime on the Korean peninsula. The agreement called for the resuming of nuclear talks between the US and North Korea, which were previously stalled. But many critics responded to the news with doubt that the agreement was anything more than symbolic, or that Kim Jong-un had any realistic plans to uphold his end of it. The meeting also drew angered responses from those who believe that as a democratic country that believes in freedom, the US has no room for negotiating with tyrannical rulers who commit horrific human rights abuses. Many were appalled to learn that Trump described crossing the 38th parallel as an honor, and that he invited Kim to visit him at the White House. Not surprisingly, little seems to have come of the talk between Trump and Kim, which marked the first time a sitting US president crossed the armistice line at the 38th parallel. Current President Joe Biden has taken a less open-minded stance toward any sort of diplomatic interactions with Kim, who has continued to test nuclear weapons with alarming frequency. At the very least, the US and North Korea remain no further away from the chances of going to war than the two countries were before Trump's unconventional attempt at squashing a nuclear threat. Many believe that Kim would never take the hugely self-destructive step of attacking a country as powerful as the United States, while others think that the dictator remains one of the country's biggest threats. At this juncture, only time will tell. 1. China looks towards Taiwan. Nancy Pelosi recently stopped in Taiwan amid escalating tensions between China and the US. She was the first speaker from the House of Representatives to visit the self-governing island in 25 years, and to many, her timing couldn't have been worse. The Chinese government, which claims ownership over Taiwan, was outraged by Pelosi's visit, which she claimed was to promote democracy. It's no surprise that China felt provoked by a top-ranking American politician visiting a place that insists on being independent and vehemently resists Chinese rule. But to add insult to injury, Pelosi is a well-known supporter of Taiwan and a critic of China, with a history of calling the country out for its human rights violations. In other words, she's not exactly the first person who comes to mind when it comes to thinking of people who might be able to bridge gaps rather than deepen existing ruptures. Regardless of Pelosi's intentions, her visit had a less than diplomatic effect on China-US relations. In response to the audacious move, the Chinese government made it clear that it's done cooperating with the US on several key issues, including climate change, military discussions, and anti-drug efforts. The country also fired numerous missiles in the waters off Taiwan following Pelosi's appearance, and visibly increased its military presence in the region, performing massive drills around the island. Even before Pelosi's trip, it was clear that many believed it was a bad idea. President Biden reportedly admitted that he knew the visit was not a good idea right now, and even reminded Chinese President Xi Jinping ahead of the speaker's travels that he couldn't stop her from going to Taiwan. New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman described the planned visit as utterly dangerous, reckless, and irresponsible. He warned that the politician's purely symbolic appearance would do nothing to benefit Taiwan, and that the trip could potentially immerse the US into indirect conflicts with other nuclear-armed countries, including China and Russia, possibly at the same time. Friedman went on to speculate that the US probably wouldn't receive much, if any, support from its European allies if it became entangled in a dispute with China. China's heavily militarized response and cold cutoff of discussions with the US has sparked concerns that an attack on Taiwan is a distinct possibility. And while Pelosi's visit seemed to mark a turning point in the deterioration of China-US relations, some have argued that things have been on a declining trajectory for some time. From an official standpoint, the US adheres to a One China policy, which means that it considers Taiwan to be under Chinese jurisdiction. But the recent actions of several leaders seem to speak to the contrary. When asked earlier this year if the US would defend Taiwan against a Chinese attack, President Joe Biden boldly and without hesitation said, "Yes, that's the commitment we made." His commentary sparked both annoyance and confusion. Based on the policies in place, the US is required to provide Taiwan with the resources to defend itself if needed. But the terms don't allot for direct military intervention. The lack of clarity resulting from the conflict between policy and politicians' words only seems to be fueling China's frustration. And while it's unclear whether these rising tensions could erupt into armed conflict or missile attacks anytime soon, the atmosphere surrounding the situation increasingly feels like that of a ticking time bomb. Thanks for watching. What do you think of these potential missile launches? Tell us in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. Bye.